Okay, well, welcome to our webinar. I apologize in advance. This one is going to be a little research nerdy, if you will, because some of us are research nerds, I guess. This is Fred Jacobs from Jacobs Media. We've been conducting tech surveys now for 12 years. And this little exercise actually turned out to be extremely interesting. I actually went back over 12 years worth of tech surveys dating back to around 2005, and wow, there was really a lot of great stuff in here. So this is sort of a greatest hits of tech survey, a lot of really interesting findings that really do, I think, shed a lot of light on what has been happening with media, technology, and of course radio over this time. And in the process of writing the questionnaire for Tech Survey 13, this really turned out to be a great exercise for us. Hopefully it will be interesting as well to you. So I kind of think about myself as sort of a ratings whisperer. I mean, part of my job is to look at data sets and make sense out of them, make them talk, develop a narrative, all those kinds of things. And that's what we've been doing with these tech surveys for the past 12 years, but it really started with the whole idea of email being a great source for a sample. And that's something that I started thinking about back in the 90s when all radio stations started aggregating email addresses. And I thought, well, you know, that'd be a great base to be able to test stuff, whether it's a new morning show or a new feature or a billboard campaign or any of those things, right? Just write up a little questionnaire. I knew how to do that. Serve it out to the email database and wait for the results. So I did a bunch of that stuff in the late 90s and it worked out pretty well. We got answers back in 24 to 48 hours without having to pay for or wait for a perceptual study or a music test. And then this happened, right? September of 2001, incidentally, as we say in radio, right before the fall book. And as most of you know, our clients tend to be rock stations, alternative stations, and mainstream rock stations, and classic rock stations. And they didn't know what to do following 9/11. Could we continue with our rating book contest? Could we be funny in the morning? All those kinds of things. And so we couldn't answer those questions because nobody had been through anything like 9/11 before, but our experience already with email web-based surveys told us we could get some great answers about what people were thinking and feeling after the 9/11 tragedy. And we got 50 some odd stations together, wrote a questionnaire, launched the survey, and again, in just a couple of days, we had great data that helped inform us about how to actually handle a tragedy like 9/11. And so that's where it really began for us. We really started understanding that doing nationwide email database web surveys could be a very simple, efficient, and inexpensive way to go, with two really big advantages. One is that there's really strength in numbers. Now, you have to understand with these email-based web surveys, you're not looking at a representative stratified sample like you'd see, say, in the ratings or even in the Edison Triton studies. That kind of research hopes to replicate the basics of the population based on variables like gender and age and ethnicity. Our samples aren't like that, right? We just send them out to the email database, so we know people are a little bit more into radio and perhaps not fully representative of the whole, but when you've got as many respondents as you'll see we get in our surveys, there are big numbers here that have been intensely reliable over the years. So big numbers is advantage number one. And advantage number two is, as we've learned, research is marketing. The very act of sending out a survey to your email database and saying to them, look, we care about your opinion. You can help us better understand what's going on out there. That in itself is a marketing statement that says you care about their opinions, what they have to say, and what they're thinking. And we typically see many people call the radio station or email during our tech surveys and thank them for the opportunity to be able to participate and give their opinions. But before we got into the tech stuff, we were doing all kinds of different web-based surveys. Remember the Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl in February 2004? Well, we got together with Edison Media Research a little bit later on that year to do the Shock Jock web poll. You can see there subtitled, "How Much is Too Much?" So this was a great little survey that we put together, and it was very informative, got a lot of press coverage, and it really told us that we had a viable platform here. But later in 2004, here at the Jacobs team got together and started talking about what we saw was happening with technology, and we thought we had enough experience now in the space to be able to actually launch a series of these big studies covering as many radio stations as we could about media and technology and really what radio listeners were doing when they weren't listening to the radio. Now, back then, our base for these surveys, and you'll see for the first bunch of them, were just our client format stations. So classic rock, alternative, and mainstream active rock with a little AAA mixed in. That's what these surveys were originally. Eventually, we got to measuring all formats, and we'll show you those. But we're going to take a walk through all 12 of the surveys that we have to date. So look at these graphics, right? We thought this looked pretty good in 2005. When this survey was done, we actually had 79 stations participate, and they generated more than 25,000 respondents. So a big survey. And here's how it broke out by our rock constituents here. Classic rock, 4 out of every 10 respondents came from a classic rock station, about a third from active mainstream, and just under a quarter from alternative. And so we got all this data back, right? 25,000 plus respondents, and we were looking for a visual form to be able to put sort of the top line results in that would really put the study in perspective. And Tim Davis, who was our collaborator here with those studies, came up with the idea of a media usage pyramid. And so here is the very first one that we generated back in 2005. You look all the way down to the bottom, 93% of all of our respondents listen to the radio an hour or more a week. That basically, by the way, hasn't budged in 12 years. And then as you sort of walk up the pyramid, note that only 87% had a cell phone at that time. Forget smartphone, they really didn't exist. Only 87% had a cell phone. Only 84% were online an hour a day. It wasn't like it is now where the internet is just on all the time. Instant messaging was a big deal back then. You can see just under half were involved with that. Video gaming, very, very popular. Here's public radio. Only a quarter actually texted on a weekly basis or more often. Really, only young people were heavily involved in texting back then, and less than a quarter actually listened to streaming radio, streaming audio across a regular week. 17% owned an iPod or MP3 player, and only 7% subscribed to satellite radio. This was the lay of the land back in 2005, and I can tell you when we presented this survey, stakeholder stations were freaked out. It's like, wow, look at all the media going on in people's lives. It's not just radio anymore, it's everything. So that was sort of the state of the state back when we first got these surveys going. It turned out there was one big finding in this very first tech survey, Techsurvey 1, if you will. We didn't call it then. It's like World War I, right? It took a while before we started numbering them. But the big finding had to do with cell phone only, and in essence, people dumping their landlines. And as you see there in the middle of this chart, 17% of our overall sample said, yep, I have dumped my landline, all I have is a cell phone. But you can see that a third of 18 to 29-year-olds were cell phone only. Well, back then, Arbitron didn't measure people in homes where there wasn't a landline. So all these cell phone only homes were not being measured in the diary system. And as it turned out, right when we released this research, the Arbitron Advisory Council was meeting. Steve Goldstein, who was, I believe, head of the council at that point, reached out to me and said, we need to see this data. We need to show this to the Arbitron people. And that's what really got the ball rolling to include cell phone onlys in the ratings process. It really started with this study. So the next year we were feeling pretty good. We felt like we had something good going on. Techsurvey number 2, now we did start numbering them, 79 stations, 26,000 plus respondents. So we were definitely on a roll, still though in that rock-oriented sample frame. And one of the big topics back then was Howard Stern and Sirius. Howard had just started at Sirius satellite radio just before. And so we wanted to actually take a look and see, had there already been some element of growth? And as you can see, looking at the 2005 to 2006 returns for satellite radio, clearly a really nice bump there for both Sirius and XM. Remember, they were not united as companies back then. They were two competing satellite radio companies. Now, we also asked, as you can see there on the right, among those who were not satellite radio subscribers, what was the likelihood that they would actually end up subscribing to satellite radio at some point during 2006? And you can definitely see there's interest more on the Sirius side than on the XM side. So we'll come back to that in a future study, but we can see the motivations here. We just isolated out the XM subscribers. What is it about XM that really is appealing to them to a point where they were willing to pay for the service? And as you can see, it was about the music channels, number one, and then tertiary reasons, commercial-free music, and then also good while traveling, or it came free with the car. But on the Sirius side, it was all being driven by, yep, you know who. And this really does show you the power of Howard Stern and really the contribution that he made to Sirius. So these are the kinds of things we always look to do in our tech surveys, kind of find the hot potato, hot button issue and do research around that. Well, remember cell phone only from last year? Well, from year to year, cell phone only jumped from 17 to 21% for the overall universe. But you can definitely see across our three formats here, not only an increase, but look at alternative. I mean, clearly alternative stations were being hampered by the fact that Arbitron was not, in fact, surveying cell phone only homes at that time. Here it is by age, same basic relationship, right? Look at the percentage of 18 to 34s that were cell phone only back in 2006. So a trend was happening. Again, Arbitron had to do its research and make sure that everything was fine, but eventually they did change their policy. Techsurvey number 3. Now we're really on a roll with our surveys, and in fact what we're learning is that media and technology are growing to a point where we have to grow our pyramid. And so this looks like a much more complicated pyramid than the one you saw just 2 years earlier. And in fact, there's 2 new entrants on this pyramid that weren't there certainly on the original one. And I've designated them with big fat red arrows there. Streaming video made its debut in Techsurvey number 3. 56% said, yep, I stream video frequently or occasionally. And then social media was just beginning to really take shape out there. And again, first year that we asked about social networking, if you will, 44% say they were involved frequently or occasionally. Obviously, we have tracked that all the way. But looking at the lay of the land for social networking back in 2007, yes, the king of the hill is in fact MySpace. You probably forgot about classmates.com, but in fact, it was indeed a social network. And look at Facebook, right? It's just beginning to get off the ground. It is no longer confined to just college campuses. It's open to everybody. And look at some of these other social networks that are here, right? You forgot they even existed, right? Windows Live Spaces, Friendster, Xanga, and look at LinkedIn, right? Just beginning to emerge. Now, when you actually look at alternative listeners, you can see them there in red, you definitely see that Facebook was obviously onto something. It did start young, but clearly alternative fans twice as likely to be on Facebook as the overall sample. The other thing that popped out when I went back to Techsurvey 3 was how YouTube so quickly emerged as the category killer for video streaming. I mean, here we are all the way back 2007. YouTube had only been around just a year or two, and already it was just killing everybody. And look at all these other video streaming sites, right? Yahoo videos, MSN video, AOL video, iFilm. Most of them are long gone, but they weren't back in 2007. And so here it is the next year, 2008, 69 stations, 27,000 plus respondents. And now we begin to start understanding what is going on with the smartphone. And by the way, this is the year that we launched Jake Apps, our mobile apps development company. And when you see the data I'm about to show you, you're going to understand exactly what motivated us and how we decided to take the leap into mobile app development just 100 days after Apple opened up the App Store in July of that year. We asked people who were cell phone owners to tell us what were the most regularly used features that they used on their phone. So texting, a strong number one, taking and sharing pictures, number two, and very, very close behind is people using the cell phone alarm for alerts to get up in the morning. And this is when the bells started going off in our heads that our apps, when we got around to creating them later that year, needed the alarm clock feature that, in fact, people were less and less using clock radios and more using an alarm to wake up in the morning. Now, the iPhone was just an emerging product at that point, just getting off the ground. Again, it was before the App Store opened. Only 3% of our overall sample had an iPhone. You can see that in all these format breakouts, the numbers are very, very small, but they would get much larger because we asked people who owned a cell phone but not an iPhone, what would be the likelihood of them purchasing an iPhone at some point later in 2008. And as you can see, the arrows were definitely pointing up for the iPhone even way back then. So that was another way that we have used these tech surveys to kind of learn what's around the corner for technology and, of course, for radio. But back then, it really was all about the iPod. And we've got now 4 years of data. This is all our tech surveys going back to number 1 on the far left, 2, 3, and this year's, and you can just see the incredible trajectory of the iPod at that point. This was really the end of the Sony Walkman as we knew it, and this was really the end of radio's portability as we knew it as well. These days, it was all about the iPod. So here's tech survey number 5. 64 stations participate, 21,000 plus respondents, and now our pyramid is really getting massive. Look at this thing, right? And we've got all kinds of crazy things in here just to see what was going on. TiVo ownership. Do people shop online? But those big blue arrows show you 3 areas of rampant growth from the year before. Text messaging now, 63% of our overall survey doing that on a weekly basis. That's 2.5 times higher than it was way back when we first started doing the tech surveys in 2005. Social networking now, half our population now is on social media. Pretty amazing. That's up 31% from the year before. And streaming, also continuing to go up as well. At this point, 39% of our overall sample streamed on a weekly basis or more often, and that was a rise, as you can see on the bar on the far right, 21% year to year. So that was a big change. Now, again, we always break these pyramids out by formats. Back in these days, we only had rock formats, but I want to show you alternative just to show you how out of control that format and the 18 to 34 demographic were. So same pyramid, but alternative. And look how wide this is. Look at all the media and technology alternative fans are using. 7 of every 10 use social media. 86% stream video on a weekly basis or more often. 80% plus own an MP3 player. Just out of control with the alternative format. And so these studies were very helpful in us helping our alternative stations better understand what their audiences were into. Clearly, as of 2009 and Techsurvey 5, we were really beginning to see the important streaming trend here. I mean, this is just, research at its best, right? When you see this kind of steady increase for a technology like streaming year after year after year. And this is what really gave us confidence that our samples were indeed very solid. And this was also the year where we really started seeing Pandora begin to sort of jump out into the mainstream there. We've got a 3-year trend, 07, 08, and 09. And as the arrow is designating, Pandora in that time has gone from, and again, this is of those who stream, 6%, 12%, 20%. So this was just the beginning of Pandora really becoming a major streaming force. So remember, just a couple of years earlier, Facebook was at 8% and MySpace was king of the hill. Well, look how fortunes had changed. And this was the first year, Techsurvey 5 in 2009, where in fact Facebook actually passed MySpace. LinkedIn now beginning to actually approach double digits. Twitter just getting going there at 5%. And soon, yes, reunion.com would be gone. The other thing that we started looking at way back in 2009 was the car. And as we do every year now, we isolated out people who were in the market for a new vehicle that year and find out from them what are the key features they have to have in their next car. So thank goodness, and it's still like this today, AM/FM radio, number 1, CD player, number 2, but and this is where you begin to see that desire for connectivity, right? The iPod and the MP3 player, almost half of prospective new car buyers are saying, yeah, I want to be able to hook up my iPod into the system of the vehicle that I buy. So again, very predictive. You can see satellite radio, HD radio well back. A few people even wanted Wi-Fi back then. And yes, a few diehards, in fact, wanted a cassette player. But of course, those days were over. So Techsurvey 6, it's now 2010, 78 radio stations, 26,000 plus respondents, and a brand new question. We wanted to find out how technology actually is changing the culture of how we interface with friends and family on a regular basis. So we gave people a list of different ways that they communicate with friends and family and asked them to tell us in the past year, have you used these tools more, less, or about the same? And look at what's going on here. You can see the mores, right? People are texting more to communicate with family and friends, using social media, email, and cell phones. And look what is on the left side. Yep, absolutely. Landlines, more and more falling out of favor and clearly becoming passe over time. Here's Pandora. And so I just wanted to show you another year of trending now. Last 4 years, Pandora, 6% to 12% to 20%. To 32%. So we started asking people questions about Pandora. If you were a Pandora listener, we wanted to know more. What is going on here? How do people perceive it? And are there any chinks in the armor? Well, this was a tough question. I remember presenting this. We asked Pandora fans, how does it compare with commercial radio stations for music? And you can see a majority of Pandora users said, I think it's better than the way most radio stations sound. So this was a tough pail of cold water here, but something that we needed to see. And then we came up with this list of possible negatives just to try and find out were there any vulnerabilities with Pandora. And back in 2009, there really weren't. In fact, the plurality of our respondents said, it's great. I have no problems with Pandora. Few complaints about lack of skips, missing real people, and no local information, but for the most part, Pandora looked really good. smartphone ownership is now beginning to get very, very strong. About 3 of every 10 people in our overall sample now have a smartphone, a little bit more male, and skewing quite a bit younger. And look what also is going on. iPhone, for the first time, passes BlackBerry. And by the way, that's the best BlackBerry has ever looked. They are gone. Notice number 4, Android has just come onto the market. And again, a fledgling platform at this point, but 11% debut for them is quite good. They already passed Windows Mobile, Palm Pre, the Nokia series, and of course the old T-Mobile T-Mobile Sidekick. Now at this point, Jake Apps, our mobile app company, is really kicking. We're beginning to build a lot of mobile apps, and that's really a good thing, because what we're learning is that 8 out of every 10 smartphone owners download apps of one kind or another. So we know they're in the right business, and we also find out that of those who download apps, a majority actually download music-oriented apps. This is how far ahead Pandora actually was of the pack. That's them in gold. In that lighter blue color is apps, aggregated apps like iHeart and TuneIn. And then that 15% were the kind of apps that we made at Jake Apps, individually branded apps for stations. Now, one of the other cool things about Techsurvey, again, is that we get to ask questions that are pertinent to the times. And we got a request from one of our stakeholder stations to find out about Christmas music. And as you may recall with Techsurvey, it goes into the field January, February. So Christmas music was very much on the minds of our respondents. And so we come to find out that almost a quarter of them said that that past December, half or more of all their radio listening was in fact to holiday music. We don't ask that question every year, but our stakeholder stations wanted to know, and sadly, for most of those rock stations, we did inform them. Well, now we're really on a roll with Techsurvey. This is number 7. 75 stations participate, 21,000 plus respondents, and I will tell you, give you a little warning in advance, this was the year where we went a little infographic crazy, so the graphics do begin to get a little bit more stylized. But here's the lay of the land for social media now, trending all the way back to 2007. And so you can see what a monster Facebook already was. You can see upward trajectories for LinkedIn and Twitter, and then you can also see the really sad news for MySpace as every year it erodes even more. But again, this is the kind of data that really helps radio stations develop digital strategies, in this case, social media. All right, well, here are the infographics that I warned you about, but you can see up on top there from 2010 to 2011, smartphones really took a major, major leap. Almost half of our population now has a smartphone. 18 to 34s, of course, more than 25 to 54s, but one of our big takeaways here is that baby boomers were beginning to catch up and were figuring out the smartphone technology and really weren't all that far behind their kids at this point. Look at Android. iPhone still very, very much in the lead, but Android now in a solid number 2 position, and BlackBerry doing the very quick fade, sort of the MySpace fade, if you will. Look at the trajectory on texting. This goes back and actually trends it all the years that we had been doing Techsurvey, way back at the beginning, all the way to this survey, and you can just see how powerful texting as an activity has become, and we broke it out by our 4 formats there. So that's Techsurvey 7, and this is sort of the demarcation line, because starting with Techsurvey 8, Joel Denver of All Access convinced me to open this up to all formats out there. I was concerned that we would really get a lot of cooperation. I was fortunately dead wrong. We had 170 stations participate, generating more than 57,000 plus respondents. And so all of a sudden now, the wheel of formats looks like this. Now, classic rock and mainstream rock are certainly overemphasized, and that's because we have a lot of clients in those spaces. But all of a sudden now, we've got hot AC, news talk, CHR, sports, country. They're all a part of this, and that really opens up the doors to some incredible analyses. We color code all the formats. These colors are still pretty much in play today, few changes. For various reasons. The bar down at the bottom, the Jacobs Media bar, always shows you the average for any question, and then formats to the left run higher, formats to the right run lower. So I'll show you some slides from Techsurvey 8 that are basically the same basic style that we are using today. We started doing fun stuff with pyramids back in 2012, Techsurvey 8, juxtaposing men versus women, the Venus and Mars pyramid, if you will. And those little male designations that I just popped on the left-hand male side are things that men did more than women back then. Streaming and satellite radio, definitely. And on the right-hand side, areas and activities that women were more involved with, especially social media, texting, and yes, we asked about Groupon back then. More than half of our women were involved in Groupon. So again, these are some of the areas that we were able to investigate when couponing became a big deal. But the beauty of Techsurvey 8 is we got to see formats that we had never seen before. So here's mainstream AC, and yes, they were very much into Groupon back then. Here was country back in 2012. I mean, again, we had never seen these formats, so this really turned out to be a very exciting year for us. It was also the first year that we actually took a look back at radio. You know, with all the technology that was coming out, we wanted to find out, why do people still listen to broadcast radio when there are so many options out there? And so we created this pyramid where we gave our respondents a list of various qualities and ask them to tell us what are the main reasons why you listen to AM/FM radio. So we learned that music was obviously very important, followed by personalities, but this is where we first discovered the importance of what we came to call these factors emotional drivers. People enjoying working with the radio, mood elevation, companionship, and escape. Those are all values that we see every year, and we were able to break these out by format to be able to really provide even more granularity for our stakeholder stations. Now, if you pay for your data, you actually get all this information just on your own discrete audience. So you can see how your audience looks, you can compare it to your format, you can also compare it to the overall mega sample. And this is what our format slides began to look like, starting with Techsurvey 8. So in this case, 52% of our overall sample owned a smartphone, but you look all the way to the left and you can see clearly fans of alternative, CHR, rock, and sports definitely well ahead of average, and on the right-hand side, classic rock, contemporary Christian, and adult contemporary lagging behind a bit. So this was really the format that we began to use for all of our surveys. You may or may not be familiar with Net Promoter. We've actually been asking Net Promoter all the way back to our very first tech survey. It is a recommendation scale used by all the big boys like Walmart and Starbucks. And the way the scale works is from 0 to 10, where 10 means extremely likely, and 0 means not at all likely. How likely are you to recommend the station that sent you the survey to friends or family members? And it's a tough scale, right? 9s and 10s are promoters, that's it. Not 7s and 8s, you've got to have a 9 or a 10 to be a promoter. 0s through 6s are detractors. And then to come up with the score, you take your promoters, you subtract the detractors, and you come up with a Net Promoter Score. And so now for the first time, we were actually able to develop Net Promoter recommendation scores for all the formats on the wheel of formats, if you will. So overall, we have a 42 score for the average station in Techsurvey 8, but look all the way to the left, that big gold bar is in fact contemporary Christian, the format that generates the most loyalty and recommendation, followed by country, classic rock, and then just a little bit below average, mainstream rock and hot AC. But this is really great data for radio stations to have about their individual audiences here. It is great to track this over time. Well, now we're on a roll. We are definitely committed to doing this with multi-formats as we did in Techsurvey 8. We have 264 stations participate for Techsurvey 9, generating 78,000 plus respondents. And we do something different here in Techsurvey 9, something that we don't think anybody in radio had done before, and that was break out our survey by generations, right? There's so much talk about boomers versus millennials, also known as Generation Y, and we thought, why not stratify our sample by generations? And it's worked out great. We have used it extensively ever since. And so what that has allowed us to do is not just generate pyramids by individual stations and formats, but also by generations. So here are boomers, and I'm going to contrast them with millennials. Watch these bars widen. Yep, crazy, right? And so we have been tracking boomers, Xers, millennials, yes, the silent generation, and yeah, even Generation Z these past 3 years. Great, great stuff. A new question in Techsurvey 9 had to deal with how do your fans actually interact with you these days? And so we came up with a list of all these different interaction points from email to the request line, and we asked respondents, how do you frequently interact with the station that sent you the survey? So it's an email survey. You would expect number one to be email. In fact, it is. Website number two, followed by the stream on a computer. Facebook contesting obviously plays a role. Many people join email databases, of course, to win a prize. But what we found fascinating is that the more common ways of interfacing with a radio station back in the good old days, just a few years ago, were seeing stations at events or picking up the phone and calling the request line. Well, you can see how far down the interaction pecking order those two methods of communication have in fact become. Another new wrinkle in Techsurvey 9 was to look at people who were listening to less radio from year to year and find out where the negatives were. Why were people turning away from broadcast radio? So this is the overall group here, and we asked people to tell us the main reasons why they were listening to less AM/FM radio year to year. So number one is lifestyle change. These are people who have moved, changed jobs, gone to school, all those things. So let's eliminate that as a variable because that's something that we can't control. But look at the two biggest negatives. They are, in fact, unforced errors, right? Self-inflicted wounds, people not enjoying the programming on their stations, or believing that there are just too many commercials. Now, all these other factors, these external factors from iPods to Pandora to satellite radio, that is part of what we call the tyranny of choice, no doubt about it. People definitely having their radio listening eroded by having all these other options. But this is something that we track every year in our Techsurvey. We also this year started tracking digital dashboards, or what we now know them as connected cars. And at this point, in Techsurvey 9, 11% of our overall sample drove a car like this. Look all the way to the left, led by country fans and news talk fans. And what was interesting is when we broke this out by generation, unlike so many new technologies where younger people lead the way, this was one of those rare anomalies where it was actually the boomers leading the way. And one of the reasons was only high-end vehicles at that time really offered connectivity, touchscreens, all those kinds of things. And so it was the boomers, in fact, leading the way. We also started asking our respondents who were in the market for a new vehicle, what are the most important features here? So you're looking at 2012 in blue, 2013 in red. And the good news is AM/FM radio led back then, it leads today, followed by the CD player. But what we also started noticing is that the desire for connectivity in the car continued to grow. The iPod connector, Bluetooth, And then even some of these sub features like satellite radio, Wi-Fi, the entire system, and HD radio showing signs of growth as well. The other thing we learned in Tech Survey 9 is that it wasn't just about Facebook, that other social media platforms were beginning to gain in stature, and it was important for stations to pay attention to them as well. So these were the most popular social networking sites in 2012, right? Facebook #1, LinkedIn #2, followed by Twitter. And here's what was actually going on in 2013. And we really begin to see some serious growth for Twitter, Pinterest, even Google Plus, and again, MySpace, right? At a time when social media is absolutely exploding, MySpace is just absolutely dead in the water. So again, very, very telling there as we can see. Oh, and yeah, Instagram was just beginning to emerge. And look, all the way down at the bottom, this was the very first year, yup, for Snapchat. So that's what we try and do in our tech surveys, is catch them at a very early point so we can help you better understand which ones are going to catch on. Well, remember, we were also looking at some of the negatives of Pandora. Here they were. I showed you this data back in 2012. Look what happens now in 2013. The #1 negative isn't song skipping, it's commercials, because, yup, Pandora is beginning to add commercials to their system in order to pay the bills. And sure enough, yup, no question about it, commercials #1. All right, that brings us up to Tech Survey 10. 199 stations participated, 37,000 plus respondents. We wanted to find out some of the other impact of social media. Here was a very cool agree-disagree question that we launched that year. Agree-disagree, I find myself listening more to stations that interact with me socially. And as you could see, 3 of every 10 respondents back then said, yeah, absolutely, I will listen more to stations that pay attention to me in the social space. And you can see by formats, top 40 listeners, clearly ahead of the curve, followed by country, hot AC, alternative, and rock. And when you look at it by demographic, clearly women definitely in the lead, and then we definitely also see a generational difference as well. Something that we did different in the survey was to try and learn more about social media loyalty and commitment. So here are the top social media sites. Think of these as cum, right? These are all the sites that they have a profile on, and again, the pecking order here I think is pretty much as you would expect it to be. But the new question this year had to do with sort of time spent listening or time spent socializing. We asked these same people, which of these social media platforms do you use on a daily basis or more often? And there it is. This really shows you why Facebook is so powerful. Not only is almost everybody on it, but of them, 3/4 use Facebook every day. Back then, the only other platforms that were even respectable were Twitter and Instagram at 15%. New question, oh yeah, and of course there's MySpace. No one used it. There were just people telling us that they still had a profile on MySpace. New question here in Tech Survey 10, what are the main reasons why you enjoy using Facebook? And you can see it down there at the bottom. Facebook is about connecting with friends and family. That's really what it's about. And this really proved that all social media are very different from each other. Here's Twitter, and look at the #1 motivation for using Twitter. It's to follow people who are interesting. Secondarily, news and information, 2 very different motivations for social media sites. They are not all the same. This is when we really began to see something going on with sharing. The question is, how often do you share things with friends, family members, and others that you see on websites, social media, or in emails? Tech Survey 8, 13%, Tech Survey 9, 17%, and in this Tech Survey, 34%, led by women and of course millennials. We thought we might actually have a data problem here with a double growth curve here for sharing, but in fact every year since, frequent sharing continues to grow a little bit in our newest tech survey, up to 36%, so it's the real deal. Another fun question that we launched in Tech Survey 10, agree, disagree, I am addicted to my mobile phone, and you can see more than a third agree or agree strongly with that statement, obviously led by the most honest people out there, members of Gen Z and Gen Y. That brings us up almost to the present time. Tech Survey 11, back in 2015, 220 stations, 41,000 plus respondents, and this was a year of change because these pyramids were getting so crowded, as you saw, that we finally had to separate out media usage by brand and by gadget rather, with media usage by brand. So all of a sudden now, this media usage pyramid is all about platforms and gadgets, right? It's about texting, it's about social, it's about smartphones, but there are no product names on this pyramid now. These are big, broad usage silos. So the big change here was to actually glom together all the brands that were floating around out there that were becoming more and more important in people's lives. And so this was the year that we actually launched the second pyramid, the brand platform pyramid, and we learned a lot. Look at Facebook. This is all pretty much weekly usage there. Facebook at 71%, YouTube, over half of our respondents use YouTube on a weekly basis or more often. Netflix, also more video on demand. In fact, people use video on demand more than they do audio on demand, as you can see with Pandora and Spotify way up there on top. So we started doing these brand platform pyramids, and the cool thing is we can break them out in lots of different ways. So this is a brand platform pyramid with millennials on the left, boomers on the right, and you can definitely see a lot more activity on the gold bars than you see in the light blue bars. So we do these brand platform pyramids for individual stations that buy their local data, by format, by generations, lots of different ways to better understand what's important. Oh, and just to kind of give you an idea of how we analyze these, those are little Mark Zuckerbergs signifying all the areas where millennials outpace boomers, and you can see there's a lot of them. And then the areas, those are little John Lennons, where boomers actually outperform millennials, and that's in LinkedIn and satellite radio, and that's about it. New question in Tech Survey 11, would you be willing to register in order to access the stream? Really good news here. 2/3 of our respondents say absolutely positively. You look all the way to the left and you can see that fans of rhythmic CHR, AAA, classic rock, mainstream rock, urban AC, clearly higher there. This is an important ROI question for radio stations and radio companies, and we continue to ask it and trend it. And then again, we were able to actually create these kinds of format slides for things like Spotify listening, learning that when it comes to a platform like Spotify, alternative fans are head and shoulders above everybody else. So we break these out for Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Netflix, all of those. That's really part of the learning process. Well, remember when we talked way back at the beginning about how the alarm in cell phones was beginning to grow in importance? Well, we started asking the question about how do you actually wake up in the morning with a phone or clock radio or some other way, and you can see the phone using ringtones is now #1, followed quite distantly by clock radio, whether it's used to play a station or a buzzer. And when we actually did the math and added it up, this was the year where we actually had a push. Just as many people were waking up with a clock radio as their mobile phone. In our newest tech survey now, mobile phone has in fact surpassed clock radios, so we're happy that we have that clock radio in all of our JCAPS apps. But just to show you how generational it really is, you're looking at the generations here that wake up to the clock radio, and again, led by boomers, their parents, and tertiary Xers. But when you look at who wakes up to their mobile phone, yep, no surprise, it is in fact millennials. We started working with Next Radio to begin to incorporate Next Radio questions. This is one of those questions that first made an appearance last year. We are trending these as well. And then this turned out to be a really interesting question as well. How often do you actually change your audio settings in the car that you drive? And the bottom line here is that almost 7 of every 10 people say they rarely, if ever, change their car settings. So this is why dealer training has become so important to radio here. If people aren't trained how to actually use the car radios in the vehicles that they purchase or lease, that's an issue because most people rarely, if ever, change their settings. And so that brings us to last year's survey. Few new wrinkles here. We started asking about where people actually have radios, and we're beginning to learn that especially when it comes to millennials, and you can see that here clearly, radios are beginning to disappear from the home front. Here is the sharing trajectory. I showed this to you a survey ago. You can see that sharing continues to grow by leaps and bounds. Another area that we're now measuring is how do people actually listen to your radio stations by platform. We ask them to think back to the previous week and tell us what percentage of their listening to your stations is happening on what platforms. And we can see with the big slice there at the bottom that almost half of consumption to your radio station now occurs while people are in their cars. About 28% of consumption is people listening to a regular radio at home, work, or school. We add that together and we learned that 77% use a traditional radio to listen, but 20% use a digital source, digital consumption, and that streams apps, as you can see there. And compared to the year before, digital continues to rise every year. And as we know, these are platforms that Nielsen definitely has trouble measuring, right? They do a good job with the terrestrial listening, not as good a job with the stream. On-demand TV viewing there, ignore that errant arrow on the right. It'll make sense in a moment. But this is the first year that we actually started looking at how much of TV viewing is on demand. And you can see that when you add together those who say at least half to most to all of it, it is a very big percentage. 48% now of all TV viewing, half or more on demand, and it's really driven by younger people, as you can see there with the arrow. But interestingly, and this is really the point of this, is that if you're into on-demand video, look all the way down there at the bottom, chances are good that you are into on-demand audio. There is clearly a relationship as we're learning. So podcasting really becoming a bigger and bigger deal. 20% overall of our sample last year, or this year rather, access podcasts on a weekly basis or more often, especially younger people, as you can see generationally. But again, I just drew some dots around Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, and Amazon Prime users, and you can see those also happen to be the most frequent podcasters as well. And podcasting has momentum. We learned this year that among those who listen to podcasts monthly or more often, 27% say I'm even more into podcasts this year than I was last year. So it's growing. And that growth is really occurring as, again, you can see from that progressively younger generational model. New question last year, and we're going to even do a better job this year of developing more categories, but we wanted to know if you are a monthly podcast user, or more frequently than that, what are the types of podcasts that you enjoy listening to most often? So number one, of course, is radio stations that have already aired, whether it's the Preston and Steve podcast or Fresh Air and Public Radio, followed by current events, politics, comedy, sports, and music. But this is for the overall sample. We're able to break this down by format and, of course, by individual radio station to help you learn more about what kind of podcasts your audience is into. Last year also marked our first share of car. So we asked people to think back to a typical day in the car and how do they actually apportion their audio listening. So radio, AM/FM radio has a 66 share, satellite radio a 10 share, personal music collections a 10 share, and then all these other sources much smaller than that. So this looks really good for radio in the car. However, if you isolate out those who have a connected car, watch what happens. Yep, AM/FM radio drops more than 10%, and it's satellite radio that's the big winner. So we're going to continue to track this as we go. How do people feel about their connected cars? Well, by and large, they love them, right? 4 of every 10 love their connected car, more than a quarter like it. These are really big numbers, and as you can see, they're pretty consistent across all of our groupings here, whether it's gender, generation, ethnicity, or even market size. And just one of those frivolous questions that we asked last year, vinyl records, what's going on with that? The agree-disagree statement, I regularly listen to vinyl, 14% agreed or agreed strongly, men more than women. But isn't it amazing here? These are not big numbers, but millennials are as likely to listen to vinyl as are boomers, the ones who actually grew up listening to 33 1/3 LPs, if you will. So again, something that we're just sort of keeping an eye on. So that takes us through 12 tech surveys, and I hope you have found it to be an interesting journey. I just wanted to give you a quick preview of some of the newer questions that will be in Tech Survey 13. We're going to ask about voice command devices like the Amazon Echo and the Google Home. We believe that voice search is going to be a big deal. We want to start quantifying that. This could end up being the radio at home, right? And so these devices, which we think are going to be in a lot of Christmas stockings in the next 10 days, very important. We're going to ask about the new connected car ecosystems, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. They are being marketed very, very heavily by the automakers. Let's see what's going on there. And then cord cutting. People who are giving up on cable TV and dish, satellite, what's going on with that? And how is video on demand continuing to grow? As I teased you before, our podcasting categories are going to get clearly more robust, and we're going to dig even deeper because we know how important podcasting is becoming to more and more companies. We're going to look at in-home audio systems like Sonos and Bose. We're going to also dig deeper into what people are actually willing to pay for, like Netflix and Spotify. We're going to tackle shared mobility like Uber and Lyft. We're going to also delve into how people are actually streaming your station. Are they using your app? Are they using your website? Are they using TuneIn, iHeartRadio? We want to know. And then Facebook Live, also a big deal this year. We want to know how that's actually coming across to our audience. What else? You still have an opportunity to get some ideas and questions into us over the next week to 10 days. We would love to hear from you with your ideas about what should be in Tech Survey 13. So again, 2 ways to participate. You can pay a very modest fee depending on your market size, and with that you receive national data, format data, but more importantly, your own granular data for your discrete audience. If you opt to go with no fee, we'd still love to have you participate. You get national and format data. And of course, everybody gets to participate in our executive summary webinar, which has become a pretty popular event. The only requirement really is that you have a good email database. Survey field dates are mid-January to mid-February, but we do need to hear from you soon if you want to participate. So go online to jacobsmedia.com/techsurvey. All the details are there, including registration and a nifty little video that will walk you through this. And if you have any questions for me, shoot me an email. Let me know what you thought of this webinar, what you think of these surveys. If you have any questions about TS13, be happy to answer them for you. So that's our webinar for today. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. We know this is a crazy busy time of the year. We're glad you could be here. I'd like to thank Seth Ressler for pushing me to put this together, Paul Jacobs for helping me review the slides, and everybody at Jacobs Media for their hard work on the survey. Have wonderful, happy, peaceful, safe, and joyous holidays, and we'll talk to you soon.